Hi, welcome to the first edition of the Conférence pour le Brésil. Antes de começar, gostaríamos de lembrar ao nosso público que o painel, com áudio ao vivo em português, está disponível em nosso canal no YouTube. My name is Ana Stringini. I am a master's student in international development, and I am part of the Conférence pour le Brésil communication team. And on behalf of the organizing staff, I would like to thank everyone for attending our panel on global economy. This conference is organized by Sciences Po Paris students and alumni, and the conference's central theme concerns overcoming inequalities, 10 years for the Sustainable Development Goals. There will be 13 panels and more than 50 speakers over 7 weeks. In addition to the relentless voluntary work of our team, we thank our partners, TD Setúbal Foundation, Sciences Political Observatory of Latin America, Educalibras, and Headline for contributing in the creation of this free online event with simultaneous translations into English, Portuguese, and Brazilian Sign Language. Before we start today's panel, I would like to take this opportunity to invite everyone to our next meeting on November 24th at 3 p.m. Brazil time, in which we will discuss gender equality and will count on the participation of Débora Diniz, founder of the Anis Institute and professor at the Law School of the University of Brasilia, Sueli Carneiro, philosopher and founder of GDLE, Portal da Mulher Negra, Bruna Gurgel Benevides, Secretary of Political Articulation of the National Association of Transvestites and Transsexuals. Under the moderation of Mayra Rubach, researcher and gender consultant, I would like to thank all panelists and moderators who are voluntarily participating in the debates and make this event possible. And now, Thomás Bastos will have the floor to introduce the theme of today's panel and present our guests.
Thank you, Anna. I will speak now in English, and I would like to thank Anna and thank you all who are now watching us on YouTube, and also to our partners from Headline who broadcast our conference on Twitter. So my name is Thomás de Barros. I am an economist, a PhD candidate, and also a college teacher at Sciences Po Paris. And I'm also a member of the organizing community of Conférence pour le Brésil. I want to start by sending a message to a dear friend of mine who invited me to moderate this panel. And I don't know if you all checked our program, but I was not supposed to be the original moderator of this panel. It should be moderated by my dear friend Vinicius Reis. Unfortunately, Vinicius had to go to Khartoum, the capital of the Republic of Sudan. And although we believed that he would be able to moderate this panel from there, in the last couple of days we realized that it would not be able, that his connection was not stable enough. Even inside the UN headquarters, it would not be possible for him to moderate. So he invited me to replace him. I hope I will do a job as good as he would. I'm sorry, Vinicius, for you not to be able to be here. And well, it is anyway a pleasure to know that you are watching us now, and I hope you will enjoy it. That all said, the change of moderator was not the only transformation that we had in our panel today, because as you know, we are all living through a global pandemic, and COVID-19 really transformed the Conférence pour le Brésil in general and this panel in particularly, because originally our conference should take place in April 2020, and because of the pandemic we had to have it now in November and December 2020. And of course, when we had just first planned this panel more than a year ago, we were not going to talk about the many challenges that we now know that we have. We could not imagine that we had this severe economic crisis and this pandemic. And it adds new challenges to the main topic of the Conférence pour le Brésil in general. As you all know, the Conférence pour le Brésil has as its main topic overcoming inequalities. And with COVID-19, we face, of course, new challenges. And maybe this will be something that we're going to discuss in this panel, also new opportunities to fight against inequalities. We are now passing through a very severe economic crisis, and we know that it's really hard to fight, to struggle against inequalities without the production of wealth. At the same time, we also know that simply increasing the wealth of nations is not necessarily enough to guarantee inclusion, equality, and in fact, economic development that does not guarantee, that disregards, let's say, equality or matters of environment. In a nutshell, that disregards the sustainable development goals, it's a dysfunctional economy. So I think we're going to be able in this panel because the challenges for an economic recovery that could maybe allow for a fairer and more sustainable development. And to discuss these challenges and maybe these opportunities, we have the honor to receive three great panelists. I'm really happy to have you all here. First, we have Professor Otaviono Kanuto. He's currently the head of the Center for Macroeconomic and Development in Washington, where he's been living for more than 15 years now. He had previously been State Secretary for International Affairs of the Brazilian Finance Ministry, Executive Director, Vice President, and Senior Advisor at the World Bank, Vice President of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Executive Director at the Board of the International Monetary Fund. Professor Canuto combines, as few, I think, in Brazil and maybe in the world, the experience of an intellectual. He had been professor in the most prestigious universities in Brazil and also abroad, with also these experiences as a high-ranked official in multilateral institutions. Our second panelist is Anna Wellenstein. She also works in a multilateral institution, the World Bank, and she is the Director for Sustainable Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. She has over 20 years of experience in human development and knows a lot about policy reforms to help developing countries reduce poverty and boost equality. Finally, we have Gabriel Petrus. He is Deputy Global Director for Development at the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, also known as the World Business Organization, based here in Paris. Previously, he served as Executive Director of the ICC in Brazil and as an advisor for the Brazilian presidency between 2010 and 2013. With these three high profiles, let's say, I'm sure we will have a very, very productive interaction. But to begin our conversation, I would like to ask a more conjunctural question to Professor Kanuto. But in fact, before asking the question to Professor Kanuto, let me just have an arrangement here with our panelists. I would like to ask you all to try to give brief answers. In this first round of questions, let's try to, to speak around 8 minutes. Of course, we have some flexibility. I'm saying 8 because I know that, well, if we try to speak 8, maybe we'll speak 10, 12, but let's try not to go beyond this, because in this way we will be able to have more questions and also to read and receive more questions from our dearest audience. And in fact, I would like to invite all of you who are now watching us to send your questions through YouTube, through Twitter, and our social networks. And we have a team that will filter and send it to us, and maybe we'll be able to ask many of them to our panelists. Okay, so let me ask Professor Kanuto, as probably the most senior economist among us, a question about the economic conjuncture. I think it's important for us to have this, let's say, this first background, and then in the following questions, we will be able to discuss long-term issues. So, Professor Kanuto, supposing that we have a vaccine for COVID-19, which is possible soon, but still uncertain. But let's suppose that we have it. How is the world economy going to react to it? Because on the one hand, we know that there should be a lot of idle capacity. A lot of capacity ready to be retaken to go back to work. But on the other hand, we know that public debt, because of the economic crisis, is on the rise. And some economists have said that even with the lowest interest rates in a long history, because of this rise on public debt, the potential GDP would be jeopardized, let's say. So do you believe that we will have a quick recovery, which some economists have called a recovery in V?
Right. Well, thank you, Thomás. Thank you for this nice introduction. Look, giving you a very blunt and direct response. Don't count so much on simply having vaccines to face the issues that are still ongoing. We have had great news about several vaccines in late stage trials, but producing and widely distributing these vaccines will take time. And in the meantime, one can note that despite the fact that the global economic activity has picked up partially since June, there are signs that the recovery is losing momentum. And answering your question about the shape, instead of a V or U, as some alluded to, or W or L, I have written a couple of months ago the likelihood of a square root recovery, in the sense that after a first easier stage of remaking of activities, there's still some pending barriers to return to the previous trajectory. And on top of this, and I will give you some figures here, or some background to this statement. There is also the fact that the crisis is likely to leave deep, unequal scars. I will leave the opportunities on what to do about this, particularly to Anna, who will speak about infrastructure. So let me use my minutes answering your question by highlighting a couple of things. But first of all, first point, the economic recovery continues, it's true, but the activity is likely moderating. The pandemic has yet to come under control. We are watching the new waves, and even the recovery from the deep drop in output that took place in the first half of the year is continuing, but it is very uneven across countries. Just to give, and it will still leave a legacy in terms of a lower GDP almost everywhere in the world. You have the exceptions like China, but there are not many. And the fact of the matter is that even with the partial recovery next year, that will be insufficient to lift output above the 2019 level in most advanced and emerging market economies. That is to say, we will have at the end of last year a situation that is still worse than the one that we had. Next year, end of 2021, will still be worse than where we were in 2019. And this is happening with a dramatic divergence in trajectory among those countries. The Asian countries have been able to, let's say, because they were more capable in general to curb the virus, they are recovering faster. The situation in Latin America and the Caribbean is opposite, in the sense that the downfall is harder and deeper to recover. But also, why did I say that we are losing momentum? If you look at trade, okay, trade has picked up. Well, China, the first in, first out case of country, you had the reopening taking place earlier, and the economy has rebounded. Even here in the US, the growth in the third quarter turned out better than expected. But when one looks at the purchasing managers indices, which are leading indicators, they are pointing to a weakening momentum in economic activity. So a double dip recession in this fourth quarter cannot be ruled out. And this has been as well uneven from the sector standpoint, because the contact intensive industries remain negatively impacted by the continued need for social distancing. Now, when one looks at the financial conditions, and Thomás, you alluded to the challenge faced by indebted developing countries, one may note that the financial conditions have continued to ease, even if with a disconnect with the real economy. We are grateful to the fact that decisive interventions of major central banks helped to preserve stability. Global financial conditions have eased, and sovereign and corporate bond yields have come down from their highs early on the crisis, the shock in March. Some emerging market currencies have also regained value, along with a return of portfolio capital flows. Nonetheless, capital flow volatility persists, and some emerging market economies face difficult financing conditions. So one cannot take for granted that the better financial conditions are a sign that the problems are gone. And also at the same time, while policy support has helped restore calm, that's the case of advanced economies, vulnerabilities are building in the financial system. The non-financial corporate sector is increasingly vulnerable to loss of access to credit, especially in the case of small and medium-sized enterprise. So my first point, as I said, is that the recovery cannot be taken as in V shape, and it seems to be losing momentum. Second point that I'd like to make is the fact that the crisis will leave behind a legacy of a higher inequality and weaker potential output. When I say inequality, I refer to the three sorts of inequalities: inequality of income, inequality of wealth, and inequality of opportunity. And that is because underlying the overall decline in economic activity, since it is a very uneven process, it's leading to an uneven distribution of losses, with workers in some low and medium skill occupations disproportionately hurt. And on top of that, human capital is suffering. Why is that? Look, the workers in contact intensive service, particularly low and medium skilled occupations, have been particularly impacted by the crisis. And the point is that among the low and medium skilled workers, one have an overrepresentation of women and youth. I read a report from the International Labour Organization pointing out that globally, 41% of the female labor force are employed in sectors hard hit by social distancing: retail, tourism, and hospitality. The figure in the case of men is 35%. And also, informal workers lack the protection provided by the safety nets in the formal sector. And women are also more likely to leave the labor force and face a lasting hit to their skills and incomes, since they are more often responsible for increased care work at home amid school closures and illness. More generally, one may say, the most vulnerable individuals tend to have less access to healthcare and high quality education, putting them at risk of prolonged strains. The impact of school closures is particularly adverse for the poorest, that also rely on access to school meals for basic meals and nutrition. The impacts of the crisis, and I'm looking at the clock, no worries. The impacts of the crisis on potential output are likely to be long-lasting as well. See, human capital will likely be adversely impacted, which will have a weight on medium-term productivity increase. And that is quite important because after coronavirus, after the crisis, we will have inevitably a shift of resource from sectors that might take a long time to recover, tourism, to new ones, to the ones that are expanding. For instance, e-commerce. And this will likely come with structural unemployment and skill mismatches, particularly in the case of people who will have extended job losses. One important aspect as well is the fact that insufficient health resource in developing countries is also affecting the treatment of other disease. Think of the fact that the population is more at risk of infections from otherwise preventable diseases, such as measles, because of the use of resource concentrating, moving from other areas of health to coronavirus. Bankruptcies may also come on the way, which might adversely impact productivity in the case of those companies that would otherwise be solid. And debt levels, as you referred to, is a phenomenon all over the world. But the question is that it will, let's say, take the case of developing countries and emerging markets. They arrived at the coronavirus crisis in different conditions in terms of indebtedness, and also in different conditions of coping with the dynamics after the crisis, because the crisis has been. I'm outlining a couple, let's say, a series of aspects that are common to all COVID affected countries, but in reality, of course, they are playing out in different ways, in different intensities in the countries, because of the different capacities of countries to cope with them. So, of course, there is lots that can be done. The way forward will have to contain the health crisis. Let me give you an example, a point about the let's say the fantasies regarding resolution of the crisis in the short term because of the vaccines. Yesterday, I read a report from J.P. Morgan in which the guys made some simulations of what would be necessary in terms of immunity so as to allow the mobility to go back to previous levels, normal levels, and so as to have normalcy. So what do they conclude? Mm-hmm. Only when almost 5 billion people have been vaccinated around the world can economic and social life on a global basis return to the pre-pandemic environment, in terms of no one needing to self-isolate, no one needing to restrict their mobility, no one needing to wear a mask, no one needing to be extra hygienic, and no government needing to run a contact tracing regime. So there is way to go.
We have challenges.
And of course, this will make the case for the need of multilateral action. Either we involve everybody on all sides, on containing the virus crisis, but also on helping, for instance, developing countries to deal with their debt issue. Thank you.
Professor Kanuto, thank you very much. It's always a challenge to do a presentation on economic conjuncture, more importantly during the pandemic, and I think you did an excellent job, and you introduced many topics that I hope we'll be able to develop. And one particular topic that you touched, I think has something to do and with Anna, with the work that Anna has developed in her career. And I'd like to ask her, Anna, you've been working on sustainable development for a long time now, and Professor Kanuto just told us that he believes that the recovery route, let's say, the route for recovery will be squared. Let's say we'll have a quick recovery, but then we'll reach a plateau. And I'd like to ask you, what could be, let's say, the drivers for a recovery, for a better recovery, I don't know, for the future of our economy? Where could maybe we put our hopes? Are there green fields, let's say, to be explored for an economic recovery? And maybe more importantly, are those green fields green? I mean, do you think that a greener economy could be a driver for economic development?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Thomás. And just a quick thank you before I start on my response, the chance to be here. No, so this is a great way to spend some of my Saturday, is talking about topics near and dear to my heart and important ones like how do we bring a more sustainable post-COVID world, and to be with such a great panel. So thank you very much for that chance. So I think you hit it on the head, Thomás, and I always cringe a little when I hear this term, how are we going to recover? Because in my mind, that means how do we get back to where we were? And I think when thinking about many parts of the world, but in particular Latin America and the Caribbean, where we were before had some serious issues. No, and so I think we need to remember that. So I love like the idea of thinking about a sort of a better future. So when we think about Latin America and the Caribbean before COVID, we had sluggish economies, low productivity, and really high inequality that was sticking, and vulnerability. No, so just a few points. Before the crisis, 160 million people in this middle income region without access to safely managed water supply, 58% of the rural population without access to water supply. In the Caribbean, the count is 400 major disasters since 1950, with an average loss of 1.1% of GDP per year. Think about the region. Agriculture and food systems are some of the best, top performing, most successful on the planet. We're the first world's exporting region, but it's got huge environmental and health costs. So agriculture in the region uses 1/3 of the region's land area, 3/4 of the region's water resources, and generates half of the region's greenhouse gas emissions. Indigenous and Afro-descendant people are 67% of the extreme poor in the region, but only 32% of the region's population. So when we think about recovery, yes, we need something different, no? And I would say green and inclusive and resilient are all quite important as we go forward. I also would draw on, Otaviano, you mentioned infrastructure. Black, for its middle income status, is underinvested for years behind East Asia, I believe MENA as well, and now even South Asia in terms of what we invest in our infrastructure. And that infrastructure is a driver not only for the services that individuals need for health and well-being, but also it's a huge driver for economic activity. And the region has been sort of draining those reserves of infrastructure that are so critical to well-being and growth in the region for quite some time. So yes, I think when we look ahead, there are really options for a different kind of recovery. And I think two things just to think about to start with. So the LAC region in general, and Brazil as well, have tremendous economic and job opportunities in green sectors. So, and those can be ones that are really attuned to the dire needs right now. So, for example, in Brazil, the sectors with the highest job multipliers are fisheries, where $1 million invested can yield 160 jobs, or plant-based agriculture that can yield 75 jobs. Same with forestry, is not far behind. And this is comparison to investments. $1 million invested in oil and gas creates only 15 jobs. And in today's world, with the huge increasing unemployment, the huge drops into poverty, this is critical. The region also is well placed to transition to a low carbon economy. So cleanest energy matrix in the world, mining resources central to the decarbonization globally, dense cities that can easily expand electric and non-motorized transport modes. So we have 85% of our population in cities. This can easily accommodate many of the moves to low carbon that are so critical. The region's 22% of the world's forest areas, and it can become an open sink, and we're already the major supplier of ecosystem services globally. And all that agriculture, well, that can be really translated into low emission agriculture, sustainable agriculture, and aquaculture. And there are huge export markets for that. So I think there's some really important shifts out there that we can do. I can give a few more detailed examples, but it's critical to keep in mind not only these growth opportunities, but the parts behind it, the groups that are most affected by the dirty economies, the groups that are most affected by climate change, the groups that are most affected by economic downturns and excluded are the vulnerable in the region. No, so the recovery that really takes them into account, that's green and inclusive, is critical. Otherwise, the SDGs, the idea of a better future in the region, is really lost. So just a few ideas of things we can do, because I do hear this even in the World Bank sometimes, that green stuff, first we need to get back on our feet and then we can, really start to address these other issues. Well, I don't think it's either or. And I think there are many things that we can do right now that make sense, that really address the jobs issue that's so dire, and address the limited fiscal space that we'll be operating in. So many countries across the world, but especially in Latin America, didn't enter this crisis with big coffers, no? So they came into the crisis in a very weak fiscal position. And so what we do now really needs to take that into consideration. So just a couple of brief ideas for the room. So one, investing in green growth opportunities and markets. So I mentioned them already, but reimagining forestry, fisheries, aquaculture. Aquaculture is the world's fastest growing food industry. It's 7% a year. Timber employs 1% of the region's workforce and can transform into a sustainable sector, pulling many of their informal workers into the formal economy. And climate-friendly agriculture, as I mentioned. So these are real growth sector opportunities that can be green going forward, but also are sources of employment for much of the region's most vulnerable population. Second idea, transforming cities into green productive hubs. So reduce congestion, water and air pollution, expand green space, reduce energy consumption, all good for productivity and well-being. So some just striking numbers for me about how important this is. 2017, we had 200,000 people die from air pollution in the region and 5.4 million disabled by air pollution. These numbers keep growing. So low carbon public transport, investments in those kinds of things, reduce congestion, great for productivity of cities. It reduces air pollution and accidents, and it just leads to better well-being overall. So these are the kinds of investments now that can bring around economic dynamism and also leave the most vulnerable in the region much better off. Third idea, and I promise not to go too long. So reduce the inefficiency of resource management. So we mentioned briefly at the start that we're in this really tight fiscal position. We also have a practice of using our resources, our natural resources, in a way that's really not sustainable. So things like water reuse, leak reduction, landscape management, energy efficiency. Let me give you one data point. So if we think about the region's electricity investment needs, they could go down from 23 billion a year to 8 billion if we move to things like demand side management, energy efficiency, and renewable energy. So imagine that, the savings alone by going about our energy needs in a smarter way. 3 more ideas. So invest in resilience. The region has 9 of the world's top 20 countries in terms of disasters. So investing in resilience broadly, as we understand it, to respond to all kinds of risks, pandemics, climate, food, we could do a lot more. We could sustain the region a lot more. So think flood risk management, adaptive social protection systems, better coastal planning, all critical on that front. Tackle inclusion and social sustainability. Ensure that Indigenous peoples and Afro-descendants, unemployed youth, slums, people with disabilities, and other excluded groups are part of the recovery. And that takes a couple of things. First, we need to understand how they're impacted. So I see much too often that we have generalized numbers about groups that are impacted, and then we say, this is how poor people are impacted. And a poor person in a slum of Sao Paulo is completely different than an Indigenous person in the Amazon of Brazil. And they have different issues, and they need different things, and they want different things for their own development. We need to understand those in depth. We need to give all those groups a voice in how the recovery takes place and how support takes place. And we need to make sure we target them. And then finally, digital technologies. So I think it was you before that mentioned, or Otaviano, we think that digital is going to solve everything. I don't think so, but I think it's a big part of sort of upping our game in all of these areas. So it's going to be critical to accelerating these actions during recovery, looking for innovative applications. Despite the big coverage of internet in the region, the access is really quite poor and needs to be addressed, but also putting some effort into how digital can help create solutions, whether it's in agriculture or how we understand disaster risks, or how someone in a slum can actually stay online and keep in school. So just a few ideas. So that green recovery, I'm a big believer that green and inclusive recovery, that they do offer options for something better after we're through all of this, but also things that we can do now. I don't think it's a delay kind of thing. I think now is the moment in how we shape these programs so that they really take us on that pathway. So thank you very much.
Anna, lovely intervention. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Excellent ideas, thought-provoking. Thank you. And you talk a lot about digital. I think we should go back to this. But you also gave us great ideas for a greener and more sustainable and fair economy and recovery. It's not recovery. You pointed very well that it's necessary to go beyond simply recovering, simply going back to where we were. I'm sorry, but considering the global scenario, international relations and so on, we heard that Joe Biden, the elected president of the United States, he will return to the Paris Climate Agreement the first day of his administration, apparently just after his inauguration. He promised he would do it in January. And it's important, I think this is an important move to put the world back, maybe, or to not back necessarily, but to put the world in the track of a greener economy. I would like to ask Gabriel, however, if this is all that the Paris Climate Agreement can indicate. Maybe also going back to the Paris Climate Agreement indicates that now we are in a new moment for multilateralism and international cooperation. Do you think that we are going to see a change after years of isolationism from the Trump administration? And what could be the consequences of that, Gabriel? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thomás, and very nice to see you, Professor Otaviano. Nice to meet you, Anna. And thanks, Conférence, pour le Brésil, for the invitation. I'd like to start with a big shout out to all my friends and colleagues in Brazil who are watching this very timely and fruitful debate, and also friends from all over the world. I think that's a unique opportunity to have Professor Kanuto, Anna from the World Bank, myself from the ICC. So the ICC is it's a World Business Organization. We do represent more than 45 million business. So I think it's a big responsibility now. And to answer your question, Thomás, I think we have many reasons now to start to be optimistic again. And perhaps it's a little bit of wishful thinking from my head, but I think we must be optimistic. I think being optimistic is perhaps the key drive for us now to think out of the box and looking ahead for solutions to rebound and to ensure that the global economy will get back on track. But I must disagree with some of the talks now that in general we are having in some of the recent debates about restarting the global economy, because I don't think the right way is to restart, but we need to think differently. As Professor Canuto mentioned, I think the pandemic is exposing the damaging impacts of inequalities in every society, from Brazil to the US, where racial divide, for example, is a key topic. And we corporates, we must step in. The companies must address not only the issues related to social inequality, but we must speak about why Black Lives Matter, for example. And we had recently this week in Brazil, a few days ago or yesterday, another example of why we need everyone in the society, from governments to corporates. We need to step in those discussions. And this is related to economic development. It's related to well-being. It's related to providing everyone access to basic human rights to strive as employees or as entrepreneurs. If we don't think about the basis of the Mellow Pyramid, if we don't think about the premise about being a human being, having your rights and secured by governments and by key actors in the society, we're not able to think how the global economy will bounce back. So I think we have a unique opportunity to make different things now. And much of what Anne explored about green recovery and digitization, they're for sure key pillars to drive a different planet now. So I think, yes, we should be optimistic. I think the election of Joe Biden opens a new avenue for multilateralism. But I think we're so bad habituated, like in the last few years, where we are the new normal. And that's a fun expression when we speak about COVID. But just coming back, before COVID, there was a new normal and we were used with that. We were used with populism. We were used to, companies, they need to adapt to trade wars. Societies, they were, now we're getting used about hate speech in social media. So I think the election of Joe Biden and perhaps if we're able to see more empathic global leaders stepping in other countries, they're not. I don't think they will simply provide the keys for the global solutions, but we're perhaps just getting back to the previous normal that we got habituated with in the few years. So I think reinforcing the importance of multilateralism and global cooperation is just the first step. I mean, this is a no-brainer. This should be a no-brainer. And unfortunately, over the past few years, some global leaders they were not on the same basis of of how we actually need to build global solutions for global problems. And I think COVID, that's one of the biggest lessons of COVID, is actually we can't blame globalization, for example, on the pandemic, because actually we need to work together on global solutions. If my country has a vaccine, it doesn't mean nothing if my neighbors, they don't have access to vaccine. So I think one big lesson of COVID, and this applies to the debate on the future and the economic recovery of the planet, is yes, definitely multilateralism is a basic premise, but we shouldn't be satisfied only with that. So looking ahead, I'll just speak a little bit about the impact on the small business. So as you know, 80% of global business are formed by what we call small and medium-sized companies. We had conducted very recently a survey with the United Nations Capital Development Fund. They are a UN agency that oversees mainly small business at global level. And we have identified that with COVID, more than 40% of SMEs in the globe, they're risking to shut down. It's a lot. So if we do consider that 80% of global business are formed by SMEs, and almost 40% of them, they're considering to shut down, I think the economic impacts of that will be really, really harsh in the following years, and especially for young people. So that's another issue I'd like to cover in this brief presentation. Please, Thomás, let me know if I'm complying with the time. Please feel free to interrupt me.
You still have 1 or 2 minutes.
Another issue that Professor Kanuto covered, brought to discussion, is about human capital. And even before COVID, many of the jobs, they were simply disappearing because technology is evolving, artificial intelligence is taking the place, robotics, and it's good. I mean, I think this is part of the human progress, and we must embrace science. But we have a responsibility to upskill those people who are getting out of the job market, of the labor market. And that's not only a responsibility of companies, it's also a responsibility of corporates. We do need to step in. And that's a responsibility we must take in ICC as a global business organization, and our members. We must think about how to upskill and reskill the global labor force. And now with COVID, I think this is even more important now. So we should think about investing more in human capital. And that was interesting, because one of the questions in the video, an interview I gave this week for Headline, was, what is the role of the financial markets in this crisis compared to 2009? I think now the solution perhaps is investing more in human capital. And I'm sure that if we provide people the necessary tools for them to become entrepreneurs, for example. So we launched very recently a project in Beirut, just after the blast in Lebanon, which is the ICC Center of Entrepreneurship, actually to work with the all Arab region. As you know, there's a huge diaspora from Arab youth, even before COVID, but they are highly qualified, they succeed in their studies, but they don't find jobs in the Middle East. But but we should think one thing. I think finding jobs shouldn't be the only option for young people who leave the university or even before. Why not becoming entrepreneurs? And that's why I'm just adding this last idea for debate. On top of green growth, on top of digitization, I do believe that entrepreneurship is a key topic for us for the global economic rebound. Thanks, Thomás.
Gabriel, thank you very much. Indeed, this is a possibility and also a challenge for us, entrepreneurship. I'd like to ask a question to Professor Kanuto. In fact, we are already receiving many questions, and I selected one of them. It's related to what we were discussing about multilateralism and how the election of Joe Biden could maybe create a more welcoming global condition for multilateralism. So it could be, let's say, good for globalization, but on the other hand, we can see some structural factors maybe disincentivizing globalization. So we are seeing an increase in protectionism all over the world. For instance, here in France, the President Macron, he's been defending a lot the made in France, and we saw protectionism increasing all over the planet. Additionally, and here I would like to connect with the question from Octavio de Barros. He asks, in fact, about technologic discrepancies. In fact, let me take his question. He asks if there is not a challenge for countries, for developing countries, to compensate and to meet the developing countries in technology, because, well, nowadays we see that the previous advantages, relative advantages of developing countries in terms of lower wages, etc., they are not playing the same role. There's less incentive for companies to open factories abroad. And so what do you think? What are the challenges of technology? Because Anna talked about digital and how digital could be a possibility for development, and I think that Gabriel also touched this point, but there are also challenges in this. What do you think about it?
Right.
How
Look,
technology can go ahead.
COVID has, let's say, accelerated history in the sense that some of the challenges that we are facing now, they were not created by COVID, but COVID is speeding them up. And that applies to the reference to deglobalization that you made, in the sense that there were already strains in the approach to globalization that we were starting to watch, and then COVID has led to this inward orientation and some policy reactions in the direction of President Macron. I remember President Macron comes to my mind his speech on defining a line of strategic sectors to be protected, to be made in France. And the point is always, where does the country draw the line of strategic? I don't believe that this is an absolute movement, that is to say, a return, a full reversal of globalization. From the standpoint of the companies of global value chains, of course, some of them may get more resilience by onshoring or something like this, but that would mean a cost in terms of efficiency, and so the balance is not a full reversal of globalization. On the other hand, from the standpoint of country policies, we are likely to see, particularly in some sectors, we're going to watch a tremendous movement towards import substitution of medicaments or medical equipment and so on, but not a full reversal of globalization. The other point raised by Otavio is quite important, is its own target, which is the following. It's another facet of previous history that it has been accelerated by COVID-19. We were already on the watching the digitalization of industrial processes. The whole thing about the industry 4.0 is regarding the inclusion of AI, the utilization of leading to smart manufacturing and so on. And all these technological processes would lead to, or were leading to, different degrees, varying by sectors. The World Bank has a fantastic report done a couple of years ago highlighting this, to different degrees, to different paces, but the tendency was already one of reduction of the weight of low-skilled labor, for instance, in the cost structure of the sectors, and a greater gain of physical proximity to the consumer market. So This was already taking the steam out of part of the previous globalization. Does it make impossible for the laggard countries to go up the ladder? No, not necessarily so. There are dimensions of this. Small, smart manufacturing is possible. But the point is that the prerequisites in terms of business environment, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of availability of human capital and so on to make processes feasible will go up. So those who have failed, let's say, to build the appropriate basis for the previous round of industrialization will have to do better. Otherwise, they will stay behind. So this is a challenge that is created. I want to comment on something very briefly on infrastructure, and Anna made such a good point. The World Bank made estimates some time ago about what would be the minimum level of infrastructure investments as a share of Brazil GDP just to keep the previous existing precarious infrastructure. And for the last 30 years, Brazil has been investing less than that minimum. So Brazil has been eating the already precarious infrastructure that it had over these years. So this creates an opportunity to let's say, to make infrastructure investments a priority in the future ahead and take the chance to make it greener. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kanuto. Very, very nice question. I will now change a little bit the order. I will ask another question to Gabriel, and then we'll go back to Anna. I think there's no problem in changing the order, because in the end you all speak, I hope, around the same amount of time, and you all have very important and interesting contributions. But I would like to ask, to repeat somehow the question that I raised to Professor Kanuto to Gabriel, because in a recent very good interview that you gave to our partners from Headline, you said that technology can help connecting enterprises, companies all over the world, but they may also constitute a challenge, as we've been saying. I mean, nowadays we see how technology is concentrated in a few countries, and more importantly, in a few companies. I mean, GAFAN is very important, maybe the most important economic player in the world. So we talk a lot about inequalities within a country, but don't you think that technology may also foster inequality between countries? I mean, every day more concentrated. So what do you think? I'm sorry, I'm challenging you based on the interview that you gave recently, but I think it will be interesting to hear from you.
Thanks, Thomás. Well, I think the objective of this debate is to be challenged, so much appreciated your question. I think there are two major tracks of how technology operates on what we call digital divide, which means some countries, they don't have access to, well, they're not the owners of the know-how, or they don't have not active players on the global supply chains, or they're simply assembling things. They don't bring the real value added to the product. So that's one point in which we should look the digital divide, where some countries they do concentrate the necessary know-how, especially now with the fourth industrial revolution, as Professor Kanuto mentioned. So those countries, those companies, Germany, the US, China, Japan, they for sure drive the new standards. So when we're discussing about 5G, those countries, they actually produce technology, and the value added on an increasing digital economy, that for sure will increase the digital gap compared to countries that are actually only consuming technology, such as Brazil, countries from Africa in general, parts of Asia, Latin America in general. So definitely, I think the digital revolution, if we are not able to foster those regions to be as entrepreneurial as the developed economies, we will see the digital divide increase. That's why I will insist on investing on entrepreneurship, on actually my dream, and I think that's a dream that is shared by a lot of the world, is that someone who's born in Nairobi has the same opportunities that someone who's born in the San Francisco area to become an entrepreneur. Why they couldn't have the same opportunity? Well, first of all, I think we should think about universal income for entrepreneurs, for young entrepreneurs. I think that will solve a lot of problems, even in middle income countries. And Brazil, for example, are many people, even from the middle class, they want to become entrepreneurs, but they don't have. I mean, because of they need to pay their rents. They will probably look for a job rather than become entrepreneurs because they don't have any kind of public assistance or loans that could help them to invest in new ideas in their own business. So sorry for that dipping.
No, it's great. It's great.
Question on digital divide, but I think this is related to having ensuring that governments will adopt, from those developing economies, they will actually adopt public policies that will ensure their people to think about new technologies, because now technology is know-how. It's about we can have Steve Jobs in different areas of the globe, but we need to unveil them. We need to shed light of those people. So I think that's one issue. Just to not be so pessimistic about that, I think technology nowadays can also help a lot countries from all regions, including Africa, Brazil, to be more connected. So that's the other stream of how I see where the digital playing a big role on the economic recovery, which is giving visibility to SMEs, for example. Many SMEs, they don't have they don't have the supply chains of a big corporate, so they cannot be visible unless they use some digital platforms to integrate themselves. So there are many, the traditional B2B platforms today that everyone knows. So Mercado Libre in Latin America, Amazon globally, Alibaba in China. They actually provide an opportunity for small entrepreneurs to connect themselves. But we shouldn't limit to those platforms. I think there are a lot of new digital tools now, even free tools that are being developed to connect business. And as I mentioned, 80% of global business are SMEs. Many of them are run by women, for example. I think there's a gender issue to be considered when we're speaking about small business as well, especially in Africa. The role of mobile in Africa is crucial. So there are a lot of positive aspects of technology. When we see those countries as consumers, they can actually use it, especially for post-COVID times. I do think technology can help to take those companies out of the invisibility, because many SMEs, they are invisible in the global supply chains, so they might be integrated using digital platforms.
Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much. We are receiving a lot of questions for our panelists, and I would like to address a question to Anna right now. It's maybe a complex question. It's from Jacob Castle, and well, it's somehow a political question, but it's not about the U.S. It's about Brazil. And Jacob is asking if, even if Brazil is in a good position to implement green recovery, how feasible is this politically, considering the absence of political will to implement such programs? What role can international actors and organizations play in this dynamic? Kanuto is already laughing.
Come on, Otaviano. Jacob is putting me in the hot seat. Thanks, Jacob. No, so you find an elegant way to answer. So I think it's not only an issue of political actors. So when some of our colleagues, some of my panel members were talking, and we were talking just now about multilateralism, I was thinking it's not just a matter of formal organizations. This is the way that markets are going, right? So if you think about where you want to grow today, there's huge pressure and expansion for green. Capital markets are looking for green and socially sustainable and environmentally sustainable investments, and consumers are demanding them more. No, so putting political will aside, and I can have all kinds of views and hopeful thoughts about political will. I think there's a general economic logic to what we're talking about here, and there's a logic around stability to what we're talking about here. So I think that is hopeful. I think you see some of that even playing out in Brazil. No, so when we had the huge forest fires last year, there was a lot of outcry in Brazil's major trading partners, and those trading partners said, "Look, we need to keep things in a better place for us to move forward from a market perspective." No, this wasn't just, you know, my own green and, you know, do-goody kind of world. This is really an economic imperative, and I think that is probably what I would track. Because political decisions are difficult to track. They're not long-term. They change, but I think there's a basic market logic. We're getting that pressure from the capital markets. We're also getting that pressure. Trying to move my screen a little. We're getting that pressure from consumers, and that's what we're out there talking about. No, so when we talk with Brazil, we talk about, you know, getting more sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry can tap really great markets in Europe. No, so the green dirty stuff, not so much, and not so much as we go forward in the future. So I think that's really an important point. I think a couple of
Otherwise, yeah.
please.
Otherwise, I
Yeah.
could just ask a more, maybe it's going beyond Jacob's
Thomás,
question, but also yes, Otaviano, yes, please go
if
ahead.
I,
You can comment.
you know, and Anna is obviously, as I know because I've been there, circumscribed to address some of the issue because of the political content. Well, so look, but adding to what she said, there in the beginning of this pandemic, there are many people who thought that the issues on COVID might take the steam off climate change concerns. Whereas concretely, there has been a crowding in of climatic issues and so on. And this is shown in the fact that the ESG funds have been more dynamic than any other along the crisis. So, to some extent, the perception of that nature matters and can kill us has lifted the attention to ESG. That's one point. Ignoring the environmental concerns may be costly financially. Second, there is a stakeholder clustering of interest in Brazil, calling attention to the fact that it's not of interest of Brazil to allow the Amazon deforestation to stay at the pace that it happened in the recent past. So the neglect about the Amazon will be very costly for most of the Brazilian economy, Brazilian society. So we hope that the pressure in that regard might make the move and change the poster taken by the federal government.
Thank you, Otaviano. Very important, very nice intervention because indeed we have lots of pressure, international pressure on the Brazilian government because nowadays, well, green is also money. Money is green, but also there is financial incentives in going greener. But I would like to go back to the question that I was going to ask for Anna once again, and in fact, it's also to provoke a little bit because Gabriel twice he said. He highlighted the importance of fostering, let's say, entrepreneurship in developing countries. And I'd like to, I don't know if it's completely correlated, but the question that I would like to ask you, do you think that we are moving towards, in fact, an economy that is more dependent on the state because of COVID and because of everything that is going on? I mean, is it still possible to be liberal, to be pro entrepreneurship in times of COVID-19, or the times of deregulation and, let's say, entrepreneurship will solve it all are something from the past? So I'd like to do this, I don't know, to incentivize this shock. I don't know, maybe you completely agree with him, but this is my question.
So I'm not going to take the stark reality of state or not state. No, I don't think in the past deregulation fixed everything, and nor do I think the state's going to fix everything. I'm going to take the middle road here. But I think there's a critical role, and you see it across the world now in the middle of a global pandemic, to have a strong response from government and to have a strong response from international institutions. So just looking at the World Bank alone, we're leaning in and doing financing at 3-4 times the amount we used to. No, Otaviano, in the years, you think even compared to the financial crisis, the last financial crisis, we're stepping up in this incredible way. And so I think there is a role. It's a global pandemic. It's a global shock. It's broken down systems. So there's a huge role of state in recovery. But they can't fix the markets, no? And so I think it's really finding those critical areas where you really need the state to interact and having the state make smart decisions. No, they can't regulate a recovery. They can't regulate into a green economy, but they do need to put incentives in place. And I think that's really critically important. One of the topics that I would like to touch on that I think both Otaviano and Gabriel touched upon were sort of labor and markets and how jobs are performing in the transition. And I think that's a really important area for the state to consider as we try to transition to a green economy going forward. So the idea of, excuse me, I'm trying to balance between the sign language interpreter and the sunlight coming in my window. So when we think about those transitions that come forward, I think this idea of a just transition and how we think about it in terms of policy making and investments is really critical. So we really need, the state and in general, to think about as we go towards the green economy, who are the winners and losers and at what time, and how do we react to that? So overall, I think the IDB did a really nice study on overall what would happen with the transition to a low carbon economy in the region. And it's a net job creator, like at a grand scale, but that doesn't mean that it's a net job creator from day one, and it's a net job creator in all sectors. There's going to be a transition. And so the state has a huge role in thinking that through that just transition. And I think that's critical. I think it's also critical, Gabriel, you brought up the idea of the youth and how you think about it. No, and we have the Nini phenomenon in Latin America, the youth that don't work or aren't in school, and sort of how are they engaged and how are they being sought in the transition. I think those are critical issues. We came off a period just prior to COVID with a surprising amount of social unrest, slightly different reasons in many countries, but a lot of it had to do with disaffected society that didn't feel they had a future, didn't feel consulted, didn't feel that their governments represented them. So do I think regulation from government is going to bring us through? No, not by a long shot, but government has an important role to play in setting incentives, critical investment areas, and then engaging the public and sort of on how they see the transition taking place and how they're going to intervene in the economy. Hopefully that helps a little answer the questions from my friend Jacob, who asked tough questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very. Yes, Otaviano would like to say something. Yes, you can intervene if you want. There's no problem. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. The crisis brought to the fore the fact that the state is the insurer against catastrophes of last resort. There's no substitute. And so the high profile acquired fortnightly by the state in all countries, in most countries, will leave some legacy. For instance, I don't think as far as social protection systems, the countries will go back to where they were. One way or another, there's going to be some enhancement of those. But does that mean that the public sector overcomes and replaces the private sector? No. That's why it's too simplistic to establish things like are we moved out from neoliberal and so on. Markets will remain important, but it will have a stronger weight played by the action of the insurer of last resort, which includes probably higher levels of taxation, in the sense that the higher public debt will require some time, some moment in the future that the countries ramp up the levels of taxation. And in that regard, taxation will not be possible on the bottom of the pyramid. So one way or another, despite the crisis of multilateralism, I'm a strong believer that the big guys will find ways to collaborate so as to make possible taxation on higher incomes, which will need, of course, the big guys sitting together and closing the loopholes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Otaviano. We just received a question for Gabriel. I'm sorry. Um, Gabriel, we received a question from Maria Julia, and she asks if you see that the role of enterprises will receive more pressure to be decisive actors in a greener and more inclusive restructuring. So, what do you think, considering also the interventions from the others? And I'm sorry for provoking, from trying to provoke. Apparently, I did not succeed a debate between you and Anna on entrepreneurship. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Thomás, for this question. Thanks, Ana Julia, for your question as well. I think that's already the case, as both Anna and Professor Canuto mentioned. Many of those companies, most part of them, they are feeling the pressure from the consumers, but also the funds, the ESG funds, for example, that are investing, or the investment funds in general that are bringing capital to those companies. They do want to see their environment performance, how they're impacting the society. And there, even like I think 3 years ago, an interesting initiative in the US, the Business Roundtable in the US, you have like CEOs like the CEO of JP Morgan, BlackRock coming together to talk about the importance of the purpose of the company and the importance of the future of the corporation. So we shouldn't be looking only about profit, but we should be looking about impact and purpose. I mean, and when we talk about purpose, not about ensuring environment-friendly policies and ensuring that all the supply chain, not only your company, but all your buyers and your suppliers, actually, they will comply with this broader concept of ESG, which is not about environment, but it's about social responsibility as well. There was a very interesting survey made by BCG, I think, 2 years ago. They actually asked the civil society about who were, in their opinion, the most trustful actors in the society. And the CEOs, they actually were considered as the most trustful people to address, the future challenges, the global issues. And then it came, I think, I don't remember the other categories, but the CEOs are actually they're considered more trustful than governments in some cases, and then more than the media at that time. Well, there are other factors in this discussion, the survey, but definitely think about the future of the corporation. I think many CEOs are stepping up on this discussion. They're speaking up more about that. But I think there's still a long way to go, especially to engage middle-sized companies on those discussions. I think the role of corporates to curb climate change, I think it's not rocket science. I think everyone knows really well what needs to be done. I think it's really clear. There's no rocket science on that. I think the challenge to engage the SMEs on that, the middle-sized companies, and especially in developing countries, and especially now that many SMEs are struggling to survive, how we are being able to ask them to be more environment friendly. I think, and we should. But I mean, there's an additional challenge now about like business resilience that increases our, the challenge we have about the climate action.
Thank you, Gabriel. Very, very interesting, very nice answer from you. And we just received a question to Professor Canuto from João Pedro, and it has something to do with what we've been discussing about the digital, a topic that was first raised by Anna and then developed by both you and Gabriel. And let's go back to it. But it is on the one hand about technology and the digital, and on the other hand about also international relations. So it's good. Let's see where we go. João Pedro asks, how does the dispute between China and the United States for the leadership on digital technology can impact the development perspectives for Brazil? Because apparently, according to him, there is this dispute for supremacy in the digital world, let's say, between China and the US. We saw with all the phones of China that cannot be sell in the US, etc. So what can you tell us about this dispute between China and the US for technology and how it impacts Brazil?
Yeah, indeed. This is a challenge. I don't believe we will have a revival of President Trump's style with respect to tariff wars, but that does not eliminate the technological rivalry, which will remain strong. There is this strong sentiment in the U.S., and that goes to the whole spectrum of the political agents, and President Biden will definitely also express that in terms of a perception, a view that the stick side of the stick carrot combination has to be strong from the U.S. vis-a-vis China, so as to make China to comply more with the expectations associated with disclosure and so on. So this is going to stay. And of course, this will come to us. We saw a similar process taking place in the case of the UK-US, which ended up having the UK changing the direction of their stance vis-a-vis Huawei and adopting constraints. So this is going to be a challenge. The point that I'd like to make is the following. Look, Brazil, for instance, will not be taken as relevant and will not have bargaining power in anything if it gets entirely aligned with one of those. So the only way for Brazil to maximize gains is by taking the appropriate distance and negotiating with all the stakeholders and the big leaders in the global economy, so as to let's say, to benefit most. I like to quote the Prime Minister of Singapore. Singapore is a case of a country, of an economy so strongly associated with China since its beginning, the inception, since the creation. And the Chinese descendant part of Singapore is quite relevant. And there was a consultation with Deng Xiaoping before Singapore tried its own model. And Deng Xiaoping apparently took Singapore's experience as a prototype, as an experiment that convinced him of doing the reforms that led China to where it is. 30 years of economic growth and so on. So, when recently asked about where Singapore would stand between China and US, the Prime Minister of Singapore said, don't ask Singapore to do this. Singapore will not align automatically with either one or the other. And that's the case of Brazil as well. When it comes to, let's say, 5G, when it comes to any opening and the prospects for technology, Brazil should be open to let these guys compete for us.
Mm-hmm.
Simple.
Yeah.
Alignment. Power.
Yeah, this was Brazilian tradition, in fact. I mean, in international relations, we were never automatically aligned, at least in the last 50 years. I mean, since the middle of the military dictatorship, we kind of decided not to take one side without question. We are starting to run out of time, so I would like to invite you three to your final considerations. But before it, I'd like to already thank you all for this conversation. I am really enjoying it. I would like to first call Anna to do her final considerations, and once again thank her for her participation. And I will ask you to try to be brief, to speak, I don't know, around 3 minutes for us to conclude on time. Thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you all. This has been a great conversation and so much food for thought. A few things I really would to stress. We're moving towards a different future, not a recovery, but a different future. And I really do believe that it being green is going to be critical for it to have impact and be what we're looking for. We can't continue to leave the same level of exclusion, the same deterioration of natural resources, our infrastructure assets, and expect that we're going to have any kind of growth in the future, any kind of betterment in the Latin American and Caribbean region. So I think that's critical. As we think about that, one of the issues I think that we leave out too often is this issue around labor and a just transition. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. It's been a conversation that's very prevalent in the developed world as they transition to low carbon. We haven't been talking about it as much in the developing world context. And it needs to be a bit, adjusted to the developing world context. So what happens to the SMEs that Gabriel mentioned that might be a bit dirty? How do they transform? What happens to different labor market segments that are going to transform? How do the youth think about their job future when it's going to be a green, different digital economy? How we support all those groups is going to be important to bring the well-being of a green, decarbonized economy, but also the social stability that's so important for Latin America and the Caribbean that has been off in the last years, much to many people's surprise. So that's going to be a critical part going forward. I think the impact, a lot of the dynamism, it's leaders, it's hopefully advocacy from the multilateral institution world, but I really see a lot of the push coming from consumer demand, capital market demands for ESG investing, and businesses that are starting to read the tea leaves and make that shift. And so I think the sort of composition of the panel here you have is great, sort of from understanding the big macro economy to really what is business looking for and how can we use that to shift to a green and inclusive future. So lots of fun. I just really want to thank you for inviting me to think big thoughts on a Saturday morning, and to my co-panelists for such great interventions and things that will leave me with food for thought to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's really a pleasure to have you and to have you all here. And as you said, this is a very complete panel with different perspectives and complementary perspectives. So now I would like to call Gabriel to make his final considerations. Also, please, around 2 to 3 minutes. 3 minutes it will be okay.
Thank you, Thomás. And first of all, I feel super proud of sharing this panel with Professor Kanuto and Anna. Super insightful discussion. And thanks everyone who's watching us and is, I think everyone's part of this dialogue. I think it's important to actually look ahead, and I think the challenge now is how we can look ahead together and thinking about the future as ICC as the institutional voice of business, global business. I think we're definitely aware of the importance of business stepping up to shape this new future. I think this new future should be on one pillar looking to stop the global rise of inequalities, and that's a shared responsibility of everyone, not only governments, not only multilateral development agencies, but also corporates. We should be looking very carefully to that, because at the end of the day, the rise of inequalities is a bad thing for everyone and all kinds of inequalities. I think we should look of how making international trade work for the people and the planet. So when we talk about sustainability, we should be looking as well for sustainable trade and how countries like Brazil, that used to be the leaders. I remember I was when Brazil hosted the Rio Mais 20 and Rio 92, two very important conferences on climate, and I miss a lot that time when Brazil was the leader on those discussions, and it's really a shame that we lost this position, and I hope we can recover that in the upcoming years and revert that and bounce back and have Brazil as the leader, because we have a unique biodiversity that should be taken an example of how we can actually build sustainable development, shared prosperity for all, using our immense biodiversity in a sustainable way for our people and in the interest of the planet. And I would say, as my last thoughts for conversation, that we need, I think the election of Joe Biden showed that we need more empathic people in the global leadership, not only in the political environment, but also in our companies. We need, I think empathy will be key for us to overcome the challenges that are coming ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gabriel. I totally agree with you. Empathy is central in every dimension. And to conclude our panel, I'd like to call Professor Otaviano to make his final remarks.
Right. Thanks, Thomás. Look, there is a silver lining. We are not going back to where we were. That's why the expression new normal is so much applicable. In the new normal, we have the chance, or at least we have the tendency to improve in a couple of important aspects. First of all, the appeal and the call for improvement of social protection systems will be widespread, is already widespread. No matter the issue of universal access to health here in the US, for instance, will come to the fore. We also have the digitization brings challenges and opportunities in terms of increase of productivity, and this is something that the revolution in education that is taking place it has a strong potential. And finally, the crowding in of climate change issues and associated the green recovery, which has come to the fore. So it's going to be tough. It's been tough. The answer by public sectors has overall diminished the impact of the crisis on societies. This is beyond any doubt, but it will all hinge on leaderships that call for more cooperation rather than the refugee in national competition. Thank you very much for having me here. Congratulations, you guys, for the series that you are organizing, and it's been an honor and pleasure to be here with Ana and Gabriel and Thomás. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kanuto. Thank you all three. It was a great pleasure. Once again, thank you, Vinicius, for inviting me to moderate this panel. And before conclude, I would like to remind you all that next Tuesday we will have another panel from Conference of Brazil about gender equality. So you cannot miss it. You can always watch it and follow it on YouTube, on Twitter, and also on Facebook on our social media. So thank you very much and have a nice Saturday.